Hello everyone, this is Grandmaster Josh Friedel, and today I am continuing my Autopsy series. For this week, I'd like to do an Olympiad special. I chose two games from the Olympiad to do, one from the open section and one from the women's section. And hopefully both games will be fairly instructive and include certain ways to lose, that you can avoid making mistakes in such situations. And I'm doing actually two games, so it's going to be an extra long video. So for those of you who enjoy the series, I hope you like that. For those who don't, well, it's going to be extra long, so be prepared. In any case, I'd like to start with a game of Sam Shankland as black, and actually I'd like to look at it from his point of view, against GM Emil Satovsky. This was the US against Israel. And it was a rather important match. It was round 5. The US had a perfect 4-0 at this point, I believe, so it was definitely a match where we would like to win. And Israel, a very strong team led by Boris Gelfand, but we definitely expected to get the better of them, at least on paper. In case you guys don't know, the U.S. team is quite massive this year. We got, 3 high-rated 2700s, and actually a 2800. We have Fabiano on board 1, Wesley So on board 2, and Nakamura on board 3. And of course, we have Sam Shankland on board 4, who we're going to show here. So again, most of the series is about showing lost games and how the loss could have been avoided. These two games are no different. But the basic idea is that how do we avoid this kind of thing in maybe different situations. Now, I'm not going to focus on it for most of it. Most of it's just going to be, okay, this is a chess game and this is how mistakes can be made and avoided. But I definitely am going to at least tune in a little bit to like the match situation, because playing a team event is very different than playing a regular event. I've never had the pleasure of playing for Olympiad. I'm not quite high enough rated to make the US team. I'd need about another 150 points or so. I'm not quite there. So I don't really have the experience to tell you, but I've definitely known some people who have. I've prepared some people who have. So I at least am somewhat aware of the situation, and I can tell you that the pressure is on you so much more, because you're not just playing for yourself, you have a team. So if you lose, that loss actually gets amplified in value. And again, for a lot of players, it's not such a big deal, but I know for a fact that Sam in particular is very big on representing his country, as well as probably most other people who are. So it definitely puts that extra pressure on your shoulders. In this game, though, I actually think that wasn't really the issue. But okay, let's get to it. So first of all, he shows very nice opening prep, which is something he does quite commonly. So e4, c6, d4, d5. The Caro-Kann's one of many openings he plays. Knight c3, takes, bishop f5, knight g3, bishop g6. So if I had to choose, I would say like Sam definitely, like the Sicilian is definitely in his wheelhouse. But if I had to guess, he's playing his opponent a little bit here, because Satovsky is a very aggressive player. Loves to checkmate, he loves to attack. So playing an opening like the open Sicilian against a player like that can have drawbacks. So my guess would be that he felt that Caro-Kann would suit him in this game a little bit better. Not that he was trying to draw or play super safe, but he almost certainly wanted to steer the game away from sharp Sicilian type positions, which I don't think is necessarily a bad move. So h4, this is all mainline stuff. e6. So of course the mainline, well, quote unquote mainline goes like this, where you prevent knight e5, white plays h5, you retreat, you play bishop d3, takes, and then usually e6. And life simply continues. Black has options usually to castle queenside. More commonly these days people are castling kingside. But okay, it's another story for another time. e6 was played, and Typically, this is less common. It's certainly a very playable move and is played a lot, but it's a little bit less common because it allows white to play knight e5. But it's not all roses, I would say. These lines are actually quite interesting. So bishop h7, of course, bishop d3. You take, of course, taking this pawn is considered slightly dubious, I believe, because of this. And note how you can't really take back because of check. So, you have to be a little bit careful. Of course, you don't take that pawn. Knight d7. And I think there are two main ideas. You can play with f4, or you can play with bishop f4. Autopsy opts for playing bishop f4. So the advantage is, of course, that it's a developing move. The disadvantage is that you don't really secure this knight on e5, which is the main strength of this position. Notice how this pawn is back on h4, and in a lot of cases this pawn is actually worse here and can be weak compared to having it on h5. But okay, white's still ahead in development and has more space. So black has a job to do before equality has been had. So he takes this knight, plays queen a5 check. I'm not an expert in this particular system, but I know that a lot of the time provoking c3 is at least a little annoying, and this also discourages white from castling queenside. So c3. Sam plays knight f6. He's not too afraid of the doubled pawns, mainly because the pawn, the dark square bishop covers most of the weak squares. The pawn on f5 is pretty decent, and castling queenside is still very possible for black. So he wasn't too terrified of the capture. White castles. And here Sam plays very concretely with knight g4. I would suspect a move like bishop e7 is quite playable, but maybe he was slightly worried at least about a capture at some point followed by a knight move. Probably not here. I'm not exactly sure how this would go, but this would be the move that I would suspect if I were playing a blitz game as black, I would probably blitz out this move. But he obviously had other ideas. He was still, apparently, and I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure, of course, but the word was that Sam was playing all these moves extremely fast. So I have no doubt that this was still in his prep. So knight g4, and white plays rook a d1. Retreating the bishop is definitely possible, but he apparently didn't like this one. So I'm wondering if it's because sometimes you run into g5 and takes on h4, sometimes maybe just bishop e7 and this bishop is kind of in the way. I can't really say for sure, but my guess would be that it's just too slow. So white tries to play quickly, and it makes sense to play quickly when your opponent is a little underdeveloped. So rook a d1 is played, and this bishop on e5 is quite annoying if you don't capture it, because it always is eyeing this pawn. So you can't just play a move like bishop e7 now, because this pawn would hang. Or at the very least, it would be less desirable. So he takes on e5, gets rid of that bishop, and rook d8. And we trade. And again, we could focus much more time on the opening, but that's not where this game was won and lost. So I'd like to go a little further. So it looks like shouldn't be too much for white, right? Black hasn't finished development, but you can't really stop it from happening. And this structure, like white could have a slightly better structure. For example, if white gets pawn on h5, puts the pawns on g4 and f4. Those structures can be a little nice, but I don't think the knight is any better than the bishop here. There's a hole on d6, but I don't think it's particularly useful. So really, white has to use the slight initiative you have at the moment while black is not developed. Otherwise, if black completes development, bishop e7, king c7, rook d8, it's just going to be nothing. So he plays rook d8 check, d1 check. The king goes to c7, which makes sense. If you go to e8, you block your rook. If you go to e7, you block your bishop, which in turn blocks your rook. So definitely logical. And white plays rook d3. And this was the idea, that once the king is committed to c7, this f7 pawn is a little bit tender. But the fact is that this is only temporary. He plays bishop e7, rook f3, rook f8. And again, this is played fairly fast, so we can assume that this was in Sam's repertoire still. It's hard to believe that after 21 moves he would still be in prep. But the fact is that because these lines are so concrete, moves like knight g4, these are almost always prepared moves. So if you know knight g4, you got to know what happens after rook d1. If you take and play rook d8, you got to know how your pieces get out. So it would not surprise me if this position is in the computer. Whether it was in Autopsy's computer or not, I don't know. But apparently Sam was the one playing quickly. So here Autopsy makes the decision to play knight h5. Incidentally, playing f5 or a move like this for black is definitely possible, but when you allow takes, you allow at least a pawn structure that's slightly attackable and a bit weak. So not necessarily that this is going to be losing, but it definitely means that, okay, white has succeeded in creating something. Whether it's something significant, who knows. But okay, he chose rook f8, knight h5. So he could have tried h5, but it's not really doing much, and probably black could just play a little bit slowly, maybe just expand on the queen side a little bit, eventually try to get in a move like f5 at a more opportune moment. There's just not really much going on, but at the same time it would paralyze black at least temporarily. His option didn't really impress me too much, but at the same time, probably it's nothing anyway. So he plays knight h5, knight f6, bishop takes, rook takes, which at first looks very annoying, but the fact is that this king is in no way required to stay on c7. So sure enough, he plays king d7, which I think is an excellent move. He had the option of playing this first, but this I don't really like, and the reason why is because, first of all, it's slower. It takes you an extra move to shoo this rook, to free your rook. Needless to say, you do not want to play the whole endgame with the rooks like this. But it also gives white a route in. Notice how the king now has a way to get into the king side. And again, maybe it's nothing, but there's absolutely zero reason to actually give your opponent a route in if you don't have to. So he plays king d7, but this move seems to allow a very strong move for white, which is h5. So what was Sam's idea here? If you guys are in a testing mood, you can pause your video and try to figure out exactly what black should do. In my opinion, he plays a very, very nice solution here. So, spoiler alert, he takes. And the idea is that it's just a pawn sack. But, because white's rook ends up out of play on h5, you take the d-file, and all of a sudden, it's clear that black has huge counterplay for this pawn. In fact, it looks almost like white's hard-pressed to keep the pawn at all. He can, but it's at quite a great cost, which we'll see. He plays rook h4, which is quite logical, trying to head to b4 to defend this pawn. He gives a check. Rook d2. Rook b4. So the idea is that you defend and attack at the same time, but Sam had prepared for this. b5. f4, which makes sense. Defending this pawn, getting out. a5, rook b3. So look at this position. Definitely black is down a pawn still. There's no question about that. But look at the position. This rook on b3 is, I want to say, challenged in some way. It definitely is not a pretty piece. And if it stays there the whole game, most likely it's not going to be too fun for him. I don't want to say the rook's going to get trapped. That's going to be too much. But it's going to be almost impossible to actually win. And really, it's just a question of how black wants to proceed here. Because obviously, if you give white unlimited moves, they can move the king up, maybe push the g-pawn, try to shoo the rook away, maybe a4 at some point. But there's a very, very strong idea for black. And it is one which was not played in the game, but in my opinion should have been. And that's f6. So it's basically playing against the rook, as I nicely highlighted for you guys. But it's also attempting to create another weakness. If allowed, you're going to take on e5, and then this pawn is actually going to be quite weak as well. So for example, if white plays a4, of course you can capture. But after you take, and again, if you don't play a4, the king just simply goes up. And you're, at the very least, this king is just going to be way too active. So for example, if you try this, I bring my king up, you go here, I could even just give a check now. If you go back, I can even retreat with the rook if I'm so inclined. Like you're not really doing anything here. So for example, let's say maybe this one is more annoying. So you can kind of go up. So notice how I can't really do anything immediately. But let's say, okay, I go back. This rook is still not going anywhere. And in the meantime, you have to deal with checks from the back. This king is very active. It's just the likelihood of you actually winning this position is just so low. And possibly there are other ways to play for black as well. In fact, in this position, you can also give play here, which actually is probably more accurate. With the idea that this pawn is just going to fall. You have to be careful there's no weird checks, but even if you had to go back to d3, this is actually much more accurate. But the point is that it's not that difficult. You're just activating your king. So a4 is definitely the move which maybe he was worried about, but even here, you can capture. So white takes, and now you just, at the very least, retreat and take this pawn. There's just no risk whatsoever to your position here. Most likely, white's going to have to try to liquidate everything. For example, after takes, rook a3, c4, or sorry, probably you just take this pawn now. And the idea is that if takes, you just trade everything. So the game almost certainly would have been drawn very quickly if f6. But so the question is, why didn't Sam play it? Apparently here, he was still blitzing out. So it's possible he had all this in his notes and he played this move. But almost certainly, if he had this in his notes, he would have played f6. So my guess would be that danger sense deserted him at least a little. And this is a very big problem, that sometimes when there are two situations where people really screw it up. It's when they're completely out of prep early. Say they're out of prep on move 8 and it's complicated. People are far more likely to mess up because they're just freaking out. They're like, oh my goodness, I don't have this prepared. What am I going to do? And sometimes they don't go with common sense or whatever it is. They have trouble figuring out, which is very understandable. The other one's a bit counterintuitive, which is that people tend to screw up when they're in their prep too much. They prepared some great line. They're super confident. And it sounds like a situation which you'd like. This is a situation you want to be in. But the fact is that that's often where people screw up too. And the reason why is because they don't use their brains. Now, I'm not going to say that this happened in this game. First of all, dude is 27-22. Who am I to say anything, right? But even if, he were rated 2200 or 2000, the fact is that I can't know what happened. But what I'm trying to do is use these games to illustrate why people do lose. And I can tell you that for sure, people of all levels, including 27-22s, make these mistakes, which is that sometimes they get too comfortable and therefore they play too quickly when they think they're in their prep. Or they're right outside their prep and they think they know exactly what to do. Because Sam's decision here doesn't make much sense. If you have f6, why would you try to go for anything else? He tries to be extremely concrete. And I would say that is Sam's style, that he's more likely, rather than choosing the slow path, to choose the concrete path, which he would much rather force a draw with a sequence than play some more moves without having things be as forced. That's just, I think, his style and his choice. Which isn't a bad thing, but there are some situations where I just don't think it's called for. So this move by itself does not blow the draw or anything close. So rook b4, he plays a3. So once again, f6 is possible, but now at least white can get an a3, and this rook is not completely ridiculous. It cuts off the e4 square for the king. White can at least play on here. Sam chooses a3, which is extremely concrete. And again, I don't think it's necessarily that bad. White takes, and here, white could have played c4. And this is what I probably would choose. And the whole idea is that now, okay, takes, and we have an endgame where, yes, with best play, for sure it's a draw. But you're going to get tortured here. You're going to have to play several moves. As we've discussed, team event, more pressure. I've seen endgames like this lost by extremely strong players, including the likes of Carlsen. So I wouldn't put all my eggs in this basket. I would not just depend on drawing this draw, especially I have a position like this where I feel like, why am I even worse here? Look at this rook. Look at this nice pawn break with f6. Why am I even worse? So I really don't care for this decision, even though for sure this is a draw. And clearly Satovsky didn't want to go for it either. My guess would be that he thought that Sam would be able to draw that position. And he wanted to keep kind of hopes alive for the win. As it turned out, Fabiano won a very nice game against Gelfand. And So and Nakamura drew. So all Sam had to do in this game was draw for the team to hold up in the match. However, rook b3 was played. So this decision, again, was probably about he wanted to keep as much material on the board as possible, because in his view it, increased his winning chances. I can't argue with success because it worked. But once again, I'm very confused by Black's decision, and maybe this influenced Sotovsky's decision. Because Sam didn't play f6 in the previous position, maybe he was banking on him not playing it here. But he almost certainly should have. f6 still is a very nice move, the idea being you're trying to create a weakness, and if you don't get to create a weakness, you improve your king. To me, this is just a very simple way to improve a position. And I really can't say why he didn't do it. He played rook c2 here, which doesn't look at all like a bad move. But at the same time, it doesn't really improve the position all that much. It prevents c4 as a possibility. So it could be that in some situations he's worried about c4 and then takes. But even there, you're just going to liquidate most likely. Like after c4, you can take rook c3, and eventually white's going to have to take this guy, right? So I don't think it's actually going to change too much. But almost for sure, f6 is the move. He played rook c2, king g3. And I don't need to tell you guys which move I suspect Black should play here. You could argue it's a little bit trickier now, because after a4, fe5 takes, you allow this check. But after king e8, there's just nothing. This pawn is loose. Trying to come up with a king is just not realistic, with g2 hanging as well, checks in the back. So this is just not really going to work. So you have to, I guess, calculate this a4 possibility, but at the same time, I don't think it's a big deal. And if white has to take this pawn and you recapture, it's definitely worth your while to do this. So, I don't know. It was a little bit of a strange thing to me that he avoided this move. It could just be that he didn't want to give white a passed pawn. But as is the case in most rook endgames, king position and activity outweighs a singular passed pawn. That isn't super dangerous at the moment. It allows Black maybe to liquidate further if you need to with a move like e5. The fact is that even though white has a passed pawn, then it's easier for Black to create a weakness and attack stuff. Which I wouldn't say is the case here. Now, it could just be he thought this position was so easily drawn, why bother with f6? And that's another thing I wanted to talk about, that sometimes we just, especially, we had this position in the computer told us zeros, which it does. We just assume that, oh, well, we can just draw very simply. We don't have to do anything special. We can just sit here. But the fact is that it's not that easy, as we'll see. Because he plays king f8, a very slow move. He's basically saying, I got all the time in the world, you can't do anything, your rook's paralyzed. But it turns out not to be the case. King f3. And even here, I still like king e7, f6. But he chooses something completely different. And this move told me that maybe he just underestimated white's chances and here panicked. Because he chose the move c5. Which to me is maybe the move he was just banking on here to hold the draw, to force the pawns off. But it just doesn't really work out that well for him. Again, I would have tried king e7, and if g4, f6, this is definitely not as clear-cut as what we were looking at, but I still have no idea how white's going to win. So, for example, if takes, king e4, just king back. There's nothing really that dangerous just yet. If king d3, you can always go behind the f-pawn and then move back. If g5, king d6, and the idea is that if ever g6, you can just retreat the king and just capture the pawn. And notice how the king here keeps this king out, doesn't allow any tricks. There's just not much here. If the king retreats to f3, trying to cut off this rook, you can still go back. As long as the king doesn't have a route forward, there's no real chances here, I don't think. And, okay, there are other possibilities, but really I think playing for f6 was the way to go. Mainly because once you play for f6, you can actually get counterplay on activity. So Black instead chose for c5, which is definitely an active choice. But the problem, and maybe he was banking on the fact that white had to take and liquidate. So takes, he gets his drawn position. But Sotovsky found a much nicer move, king e4. And the idea is that because of this, first of all, white's king is far better than black's now. And second of all, he has an opportunity to trade off. So he went for c4. Again, king g7 was probably a better choice. Just improving the king, because forcing matters just doesn't really work. here. A4, rook A3. And here I actually think that black is already losing. So you might ask, how is this possible? Like, we had such a clear draw just a few moves ago. The fact is that, you know, okay, he chose to play a little slower by not playing F6 earlier. He chose to play A4 and then A3. I guess we wouldn't call that slower, my bad. But rather, he chose not to play F6 after he liquidated everything, after rook B3, right? Let me find the position. In this position. He chose not to play F6 and play actively. The problem is that once he got to this situation, he decided, oh crap, if I don't play actively, white's just going to expand. Now it's my time to play actively. So when you change your plans, when you decide to go for A4, A3, but don't get to trade everything, when you decide to wait and then realize that white's king and white can improve, it's easy for things to get mangled. Now again, I'm not in his shoes. Maybe he miscalculated some crazy lines I'm not aware of. I am not a 2700. I do not have a passport to that country. I do not know what's going on. But I can tell you that this is something that ordinary players make these mistakes all the time. And if you guys made the mistake like this, it almost certainly wouldn't be because you miscalculated a 15-20 move line. I doubt that was the case here also. It's probably because you just changed your mind on what you wanted to do. You flip-flopped. You were like, okay, no, I want to sit. No, I want to play active. And I can just tell you that when you do these things, even drawish positions really change. And this king e4 move is really nice because now you don't really care about taking on g2 because you're going to win these guys. So Sam opted for c4, but after takes a4, rook a3, I think here actually Sotowski played kind of his one bad move. I think if he had played rook a5, he'd be able to win quite simply. For example, if c3, king back, king g7 for example, rook a8, and after king g6, play g4 to cut off this king. And the idea is that this pawn is simply going to run down, and it's going to be pretty tough to stop. And okay, not immediately completely obvious because you have to calculate what happens after c2 and rook comes out, but the fact is this pawn is just way too fast, and you're not going to have to allow the black rook behind it again. So this would have been nice just to get the pawn rolling. He chose a5 first, which looks okay, but the problem is that the pawn can't move any farther than that. So it actually makes the win a little trickier. So black plays c3, king d3, king g7, g4, king g6, king c2. And here, Sam played, I think, his final real mistake. I think it was necessary to play king g7, with the idea that you don't really allow white to transfer the rook again. Because now, okay, if white tries f5, you play king h6 and get your king active. This should be enough for a draw. So if rook c5, I think you can just sit. Move back and forth. White can try to come around with a move like this. Of course, there's always the takes option. But as we know, should be drawn with best play. At this point, that has to be what he's hoping for. And if king c4, you can simply play c2 and rook a2, and there's no real way to advance, because if you try king b5 check, if you allow me to cut you off, you can't really make any progress. Even if you get to a8 and b8, and play a7, what are you going to do here? This pawn's on the second rank. I'm not going to let you ever get your king out. So this would already be quite drawish. So actually, despite all those errors, maybe he got let back in the game. But the fact is that once you get to a position like this, it becomes one move or you're dead type positions. And in those positions, anyone, no matter how strong, can definitely make errors. So while I think the majority of the reasons he lost this game were due to being a little lackadaisical when he did have a comfortable draw, or should have, I think that now is where things really go off. He played king h6, which looks like just another sitting move, but after rook here, of course, if you allow takes on f7, you're just going to be toast. So he has to go back, and now they actually repeat once, so he had another chance to play king g7. So, okay, white played rook a7. My guess would be time maybe was a factor here as well. At the very least for Sotowski, it probably was. So it does allow rook a4, but he simply pushes this pawn. Rook a8, so you have to retreat or cover the pawn with your rook. a7. So a lot of these positions are very simply drawn. Simply because these pawns, the rook can't really move without you taking this pawn. The key here is that white has a clean winning plan. And maybe this is what Sam missed in this position. King g7, you have to cover rook g8 check, takes. And the problem is that this e6 pawn turns out to be a weakness. So after rook a1, comes up with the king. Notice how the king is restricted to these two squares, a common problem. The rook can't count on cutting off the king. Remember, these are the only waiting moves you have. And here, black could have played rook a6, but white would simply play king e7. It doesn't affect anything. And g6. And if king takes, of course, the check, which is what happened. If f takes, you simply take this. King goes back, and you can even cover this pawn if you want. But the idea is that once this pawn pushes, the king can never approach. A common pattern is if the king ever goes here, you can just play here and win this way. You guys who know your rook endings have seen this pattern. And if you sit, I'm just going to push my pawn. And of course, king f6 runs into rook f6 check. So the king has to stay here, which, if that's enough, if you just had, if these pawns were off the board, it would be an easy draw. But because this e pawn is available, basically you need a passed f pawn or farther right. If you have a passed h or g pawn, it's never enough to win here, because I can still just sit. In any case, rook endings for another time, but this is what happened, and white won fairly easily. Just got his king in the game, rook here, and black resigned. Of course, after king e3, the idea is not to take and allow this, which is a draw, I believe, because the pawn gets up, but you play king e5, covering the pawn, and it's all over. So that really got out of hand, and you're thinking, how can a player of this strength, I mean, the guy's 2700 something, lose a rook endgame where they were basically at the draw? They were almost there. Well, if you underestimate the dangers to yourself in any position, regardless of how simple it looks, this can happen to you. It's happened to me numerous times. It tends to happen to more optimistic players, especially if they think they're in their zone, if they think everything's easy. So the basic rule of thumb I use is that no matter how easy you might think your position is to draw, pretend it is not. Calculate some lines. Ask yourself, what is going on? And the fact is that you might have a forcing-looking draw with a4, a3 trying to do things, but sometimes there's an easier way. And you want to always pause and ask yourself, what is the simplest way to do things? What are my options? Because if you ask yourself what your options are, if you're thinking, if you're pausing, if you're taking your time, especially if you have it, which clearly he had it, it's more likely you're going to make the correct decisions. If you try to play quickly, try to I'm at the draw, I'm just going to get there, those are the moments, all you need to do, chess is an unforgiving game. If you slip for even a moment, you can allow your opponents back in the game or back to winning chances or whatever it happens to be. So just when you think that you're almost at the draw and you think you're there, that's the moment to slow down. That's the moment to take your time. And I think that might have saved this game. And as it turned out, the US would have actually won the match instead of tying it. And again, this isn't to, take away from any particular player or anything like this. I mean, this can happen to anyone. But it's a real bummer when it happens, especially in an important game. And I guess other than that, once you get that bad position, or get the position which is closer to a loss than it was before, that's when you really have to be precise. Take your time, figure out the right idea. And if black had found f6, I don't want to say found, because I'm sure he looked at it. If black had chosen f6 in any of those moments, he probably still would have drawn. So really, making sure you're always looking for your ideas, especially after you think you made a mistake. Because, sometimes you don't play or go for one idea, and that's all you need for your position to worsen. In any case, that is part 1. And now we arrive to part 2, where I'm going to show a game from the women's section. This game was also involved a US player. It was board 5, actually, the alternate, Jennifer Yu, who you guys might know is one of the rising juniors in the US, was black, and was playing against, actually, a former US player, Bachemeg Tushintug. She's known as Chimmy. I'm going to call her Chimmy just so I don't butcher her name continuously throughout the game. And Chimmy was white here, and again, it's a game where this was a really tricky matchup because the US had a rating advantage overall over Mongolia, but Mongolia was definitely a decent team. And they put Chimmy on board 5, even though she's rated in the mid to high 2300s, I believe. So kind of a tricky move, because she's higher rated than their board's 3 and 4 players. So they were really counting on her winning this game. And again, I mainly mention it because, you know, it really makes a difference in your mentality. If you feel like in a team event, you're the one who has to win, you're often going to push a lot. And this can actually open up opportunities for the opponent, which we'll see. But it was definitely a very messy game. I don't have time to go over the whole thing and really delve into all the decisions. But I definitely want to point out that, like, a lot of these players get criticized really heavily when they play these games. And, I mean, I'm going to do a fair amount of criticism myself, so I'm not exempting myself from this. But basically, what's important to remember is that, you know, these are obviously strong players. Whether we're not going over the games of 2700 now, but it doesn't matter. You know, any player can feel the pressure, and, you know, playing for a team can be a very stressful thing. So some players, you know, they'll have moments where they shine, they'll have moments where they kind of play a little bit off. And again, it's chess, right? So these things can happen anyway. But I really want to stress that these players are under lots of pressure playing for their nations, and it sometimes does lead to chess which is a little spotty. I want to say, though, that Jennifer actually has been really impressive this whole event, and she's one of the major reasons why the U.S. is in contention for first. They did lose to Armenia today, as I'm recording this video, but they're still in contention, and it's largely due to her efforts. And this game was actually a really important turnaround for them. So, without further ado, I'm showing it from White's point of view, from Chimmy's point of view, because she is the one who we have to autopsy here. So, d4, d5, c4, c6. So, kind of an offbeat line. Chimmy likes to throw in slightly offbeat stuff. She likes to play kind of fresh games. Definitely an interesting player to watch. So, she plays the system, which isn't all that common, but is definitely playable. Bishop g2, b5. So Jennifer is a player who does not shy away from complication or from taking up challenges. So she's like, if you want to give me a pawn, then please do so. Bishop b7. And I don't know, I have some experience mostly from the white side of these positions. I played them a little bit as black when I was younger, and I got brutally murdered way too many times because I took a pawn and couldn't develop. So it's not really my style. I like to play it for the white point of view, but I can tell you that these positions, it may look like you have huge compensation, but they can go wrong super fast. And if you end up just down that pawn, it's pretty bad. On the same token, if black doesn't play accurately and gets counterplay, black can end up super passive or having no development or no play. And I've been on unpleasant sides of both, so I can tell you that it's just a really interesting type of position, regardless of what it is. But most likely it's going to transpose to a sort of Catalan type position where black has been greedy and took on c4. So white plays b3, which is a fairly standard idea. Basically, you're saying, okay, I'll trade off your doubled pawns, and sometimes these pawns are quite annoying, but the idea now is I activate my rook, and then I'm going to play for the c5 square. And as we'll see, that's what happens. e6, bishop b2. And I'm not going to talk too much about the accuracy of these moves. They're mostly fairly standardish moves, so I don't want to get too much into it. Knight d5. One of the advantages for black of having traded these pawns is that the b4 square is now a hole. So knight c3, knight e4, rook c1. Again, I'm not sure all these moves are super accurate, but at the same time, they're all very logical. Black wants to get castled, and white wants to make sure they control this key c5 square. In general, if white can maintain a real firm grip on that square, it's at least hard for black to do anything. So black played a5, which makes sense. Black wants to get some activity. h4, h6, knight e5. So here white goes. I think another standard idea is actually to play knight e1 to d3, and the idea is you don't even give this option, but clearly she wasn't afraid of any captures on e5. So knight b4 was played, queen c3, knight d5. And again, you might argue it was Jennifer trying to draw. Not necessarily. Sometimes you move your pieces back and forth, you kind of probe your opponent to see where they're at. Maybe white doesn't like their position, and if they just repeat happily, you know, oh, I should probably try to play on. if they really try to play on when they shouldn't, sometimes they'll actually play an inferior move. So repeating is often a really useful tool, and I can tell you the GMs do it all the time. Our idea is just to kind of see where we're at, to see if our opponent's really happy with the draw, to see, to see whether even how quickly they make the decision. If they quickly decide to go back and forth, we're like, oh, they're not that happy. Whereas if they take a long time and try to do something funky, we're like, oh, they think their position is just great. So in any case, it's a useful tool. And here, Chimmy clearly shows that she does not want to draw. She plays back to d2. So you have to be careful with repetitions, but at the same time, it's a useful tool for any chess player to have in their arsenal. She plays bishop b4, which I'm not crazy about, mainly because I don't think the queen wants to be on d2 anyway. I think on c2 it looked, if anything, a little nicer. But also, the knight probably is going back to d3, and then this bishop is going to look a little silly. So it's not a huge deal, but I don't really care for this move. In any case, doesn't matter too much. Yeah, here I thought black might try taking and playing c5. Again, you're always looking to get active. And this actually would have really justified bishop b4. And then maybe I would have had to bite my tongue a little if this happens. Which wouldn't be the first time. But, okay, this is tricky because you have to allow knight d6. Again, with a bishop on e7, that's not an issue. So it still would be very complicated. Black chose rook c8, which, considering white just plays knight c5 now, maybe is not the most accurate, because now the rook looks a little silly. But okay. Black captures, and queen e7. The knight goes back to d3, so you can see why this bishop I'm not totally happy with. And black's position, while not dreadful just yet, kind of goes downhill here. So from white's perspective, which is what we're looking at it, things are going well. We have this bishop awkward, this bishop on b7 is bad, we're activating our pieces, so we're doing pretty well. Rook fd8, bishop e5, we get to sink our teeth into the d6 square. Kick the knight. Ah, yes. And the idea now is that there's no exchange sack, which is rather important, because after we capture, we can play e5. And I think that was her idea. She didn't want to allow an exchange sack and allow black to kind of get breathing room. So bishop d6, queen e8 was played, queen b2. And again, there's different things to talk about. I don't know if queen e8 to d7, which was played, is all that great of an idea. Probably the queen should have just gone to d7 straight away. But okay. Knight takes b4 was played, queen b4, knight e8. Probably you don't have to play e5 here. Probably you can just take, because taking on d8 always runs into d6 always runs into something. For example, if takes, rook d1, and you're just going to take, and it's going to be very ugly. So probably it was unnecessary to play this move. And the reason I say it is because now at least black has a piece that can get to d5, which is what happens. But the fact is that black's position is very unpleasant. Regardless of how objectively bad it is, it's really tough to play. So far, as white, we're doing really well, and Chimmy's playing just a great game. So queen takes b4, knight d5, queen back, queen e8, bishop e4. So this move really highlights what white's idea is. White wants to basically say, look, you're completely passive and your bishop's stuck on b7. I'm going to utilize this and play on the king side now. And this idea, again, objectively, it's hard to measure how good every idea is, but I would say, at least practically speaking, it is very difficult. So rook takes a1 was played, a move which I really understand from Jennifer's perspective. So it's not clear to me that if you trade all the rooks, you're really going to solve your problems. But at least certain things won't go wrong for you as much. It's a little harder to get checkmated maybe without all the queens. A little bit harder. At the same time, I think even if white takes on a8, it's going to be an unpleasant defense. But white opts to play here. And this was again a moment where I thought black had to use the one try for activity here. Maybe play b4, try to get this bishop in, do something. But she played bishop c8. A move which I really don't care for. I think it's a little bit too passive. h5 was done now. And again, I like b4 as an option, but okay, she plays here. Bishop d3. And okay, as white, it looks like we're doing great. And here we get our play rewarded with the move g6, which is a horribly weakening move. Now the king gets weakened, all these squares get weakened, we have an avenue to attack. We're happy to see this move. Very happy to see this move. Black maybe should have tried king h8, which looks extremely silly, but the idea is that after queen e4, you can play queen g8. This looks completely ridiculous. But the fact is that it forces white to go, okay, how am I actually going to break through here? You also have f5 as like a bailout in some positions. But mostly we're saying, look, you actually have to find a way through. You know, I might play knight e7 to f5 in some later juncture. I might try to get my rook in. I might play b4, bishop a6. I at least have some ideas. And again, it's hard to play this way. I can't really blame Jennifer for not opting for this. I would certainly have a hard time doing it. But it might have been a better try, because after g6, her position is just really difficult. That being said, it's still not that easy to break through. So again, I might have tried king g2, trying to play rook h1. I think would have been very strong. She does stuff with her queen, which I'm not as crazy about, but okay, it's still tricky. King g7, queen f3. And this is a tricky moment, though, where you have to decide exactly how you want to, play your position, how you want to improve. But I'm not going to focus on this too much, just because she does end up getting a completely won game. So to criticize these moves is very possible, and I think that she could have maybe played slightly more accurately here, but I'm going to skip it mainly because I think that her main mistakes came after. So queen d8 was played, king g2, rook a2. And here I think almost for sure, especially with the rook removed from the f-file, or a chance to go to the f-file, she should take first and then play rook h1. And here I think the position is almost collapsing because the queen can't escape. h6 is a huge target, g6 is a huge target. I think the position is almost dead. That being said, I mean, it's, it still would require a committal move. Taking on g6 is definitely committal. But I think that between the two weaknesses and this open file with the bishop here, it's just too much. She opted for this first, which gives options at least of g5 and moves like this, which try to shut things down a little, which I wouldn't necessarily want to allow. Maybe she wasn't afraid of g5 because after queen e4, but even here after queen g8, it's like, maybe not that easy. Again, this passive queen looks ridiculous, but the fact is that white needs a path in. And again, moves like f4 are going to be hard to carry out with such an active rook. So I don't know. It's a tough call. Like, it's definitely... I don't want to say what I would do in their shoes because honestly, I'm not sure. But this just doesn't work for black. She plays h takes g, knight here, king g1. I would guess there was time pressure here too. So to criticize these moves heavily would be a little bit too much, just because, again, it's a complex position with no time. You're going to make mistakes. But the main mistake I really believe that we can learn from come afterwards. Rook a7. So here, white is completely winning. Torn up black's position. The king, like black's whole knight e3 fiasco didn't work at all. And black is nearly mated. So white could have finished here with a very beautiful move. Rook a1. Knight e3 you can take with the pawn, it does nothing. If you recapture the rook, then f7, you're going to take on f7 with the queen and mate. So white would have to play some move like rook d7, and then you can do anything you want, basically. But, I mean, it's pretty mating. I think actually the nice way is just to take, and now believe it or not, you have this move. And the idea is that if you take the rook, queen f8 is mate. Would have been a beautiful victory. But do you have to win this way? Can you say that missing this is what caused her defeat? Absolutely not. You want to look for moves like rook a1, because honestly, the rook eventually coming to a2 after recaptures or whatever is one of the only things that can save the game. And it is a tempo move. So I would at least look for moves like this, but at the same time, you don't need it to win. So she played bishop e4, fg6, queen f8, and believe it or not, rook a1 is still a strong move. But again, hard to play moves like this. The idea of rook a1, of course, is that after captures, you can take this pawn. And black just can't stop mate without sacking the queen. Black can try knight e3, but you simply run up to f3. But again, this is not easy stuff. She chooses bishop b1, which I actually think is very human, because it prevents the rook from ever going to a2. And as we'll see, it should be good enough. But it becomes a little bit trickier now. And the idea is she didn't really want to take on f7 because the queen coming in, the rook coming in, it's a little bit you know, she had to be a little bit careful. I think it's all winning. But again, during a game, you don't get to look at a computer. It doesn't matter what the computer thinks. You have to find the win yourself, which is never a super easy thing to do. But almost certainly queen takes c8 is also just winning. So she played queen d2, which is a nice move. And this is where white really had to backtrack a bit. You had to realize, okay, I'm not winning that easily. But at the same time, it actually is not that difficult. The move queen f3, I think, is quite strong here. And the idea is very simple, that you're just going to take this knight. And note how the rook cannot go to a2, which is an important feature. And this knight's kind of trapped, because h5 doesn't defend the knight. That pawn's pinned. So after queen d5, bishop e4, you know, you're just going to lose that piece. So this would have been pretty much a game-ending move. It's kind of hard to see, though, because you already played queen f8 check. It's hard to reel the queen back and retreat. But in this case, it would have been quite strong, because this knight just does not have moves. And yeah, that would have almost certainly been the end. Instead, she played rook h4, which actually turns out to be a rather poor move. It looks logical. You're just trying to take this knight off the board. But black has a very nice resource, which Jennifer spotted. And kudos to her, because again, you have a depressing position so long. It can be hard to spot those resources, but she definitely kept her eye on the ball and played rook f7. Very, very nice. However, white is still doing just fine. But this is really the key moment where things went apart. So obviously, you miss rook f7, your mind reels. And maybe she was already super low on time, in which case time management would contribute to why she lost, right? And again, that's kind of why we're doing this whole series. That, you know, why do games get lost? And could be time management, that she had no time here, in which case it's already very difficult. She definitely could have calculated it a little bit more precisely to win earlier. We already talked about that. Not that it was ever like as trivial as maybe an engine would make it look, but it was definitely a winning position. Quite winning, in fact. And if you don't win that, you have to work on sharpen up your skills a little bit. But at this point, it's really about resetting and being like, okay, well, rook f7, that's quite a move. All right, queen takes d5, e takes d5, the knight gets defended, f2's attacked. Well, that's all annoying. So it's really about kind of pausing and looking at your other options. So she still could have at least secured a very large advantage by taking on g6. Nice little intermezzo. Takes on g4, and black can even play king h5, which is kind of obnoxious, but it's all kind of similar. King h7, for example. Queen e4 check, a very nice move. And, okay, it's opposite bishops, but your bishop is way better than black's for the moment, and you're going to be up a pawn. So this should be, in my opinion, good enough probably to win. But okay, it's much harder now. You've made life difficult for yourself, but there's nothing you can do. She took on d5, so I'm guessing maybe she just missed bishop g6. But in this position also, you have to take that pause. You have to be like, well, wait a second. Am I up material here? No. All of a sudden, black's bishop is in the game. That, to me, is a major thing. When your opponent had a piece that was out of play and now it's in play, their position often becomes leaps and bounds better. So you have to question, like, how good your position actually is. The bishop on d6 looks okay, but it's only good if you can push the e-pawn. Otherwise, it's just kind of sitting there. The rook on h4 is another piece, which, again, I've nicely highlighted. For some, I decided to highlight today. I don't know why that is. But it's definitely out of play, and that's something which caught my eye. So my aim here as white would be, okay, I need to make sure that my position's safe, and I need to make sure that rook gets in the game. I don't know why I should be better here. I have the two bishops, but so what? Black controls all these squares. If the light square bishops trade, who knows what's going to happen? So my choice here would probably be f3, allowing knight e3 check, king f2. And maybe she saw this and didn't go for it because it allows, knight d1 check. Because here you can't go to e2 because of the fork, so almost certainly you have to go back to g2 and allow a draw. And we'll get to that later, but that could have been why she eliminated it. Black can play knight f5 as well, but here you can take it, get your rook back into the game. You're at least doing okay. Moves like bishop e4 allow e6 and are very dangerous, just to point that out. But basically here, you know, if the rook gets back in the game, I get back to e1, I get back to a1, we're doing all right. You know, we got safe. After f4, however, I actually think that the tables have turned. And the reason why is because it's a slow move in a position where you cannot afford a slow move. You have a bishop on d6 out of play, you have a rook on h4 out of play, and your bishop on b1 is also bad. When you have 3 pieces and all of them are bad, that's usually danger. You know, you need to improve a piece quickly. But when you go from a position where you're totally winning to a position where it's a mess and where all of a sudden there are all these problems, that's when people don't do as well. And we saw a little bit of this in the last position. We went from a position which was dead equal almost, where with almost no problems, to a position where you have problems. It's in transition that a lot of people lose their games. It's not because they make one mistake. Everyone makes one mistake or 2 mistakes. This game, obviously, there were some pretty large mistakes not to win that position. But they're very human mistakes. They happen all the time. The key is that how you react to your own mistakes. If you panic a little bit, or if you overpress when you're no longer better, or if you don't have that danger sense to really slow down or reset, that's when mistakes come, and they come in pairs, they come in rows, and that's when games really get lost. So you have to be able to totally reset your expectations for a position and almost start from scratch. Because here, especially if black plays like rook a7, rook h1 now, for example, bishop e6, d4, bishop d5 is coming. I mean, there is no way that black is not just totally in the driver's seat now. This bishop is not a good bishop. This bishop may look pretty, it does absolutely nothing. So you have to be careful about pieces like this too, because it might have looked really nice in the middle game, but now it is very poor. It's only good if this pawn gets rolling. In any case, Jennifer played king g7, which is an understandable move, but I don't like it quite as much, because it allows white an extra move. King f3 was played, rook h1, rook a7, and here Chimmy panics a little bit. And this move is actually very understandable to me. I don't want to be too harsh on it just because I understand this move. You know, you have a position where all of a sudden you're like, man, things are kind of ugly. But probably she could have hunkered down here and had some chances. For example, if she plays rook e1, bishop e6, and then rook e2. Just keep the rook off the second rank so you don't have to worry about mates and garbage like that. Rook a2 maybe comes next to at least trade off those pieces. Probably you're going to survive somehow. You know, maybe you're not, I don't know, but you at least give yourself some chances. She played a very panicky move, and it's kind of tough because sometimes in these positions you think, well, if I don't do anything, if I just play solid, I'm just going to lose. But there are other positions where by panicking you actually can lose quicker. But it didn't turn out this way. After f5, black recaptured, and here I think Jennifer got a little too fancy. If she simply recaptured this bishop, I think that white's in huge trouble. Because the move rook a2 is a nasty move. You threaten just straight up checkmate. And it's not so easy to deal with. So, for example, if king f4, you just play king g6. And again, rook a2 is coming. This king on f4 is just not going anywhere. And it's very dangerous. So rook takes h5 maybe is the move she was worried about. But you just play king g6. And then rook back. And again, this king has severe problems. So as we've seen, she could have just played gf, and probably white would have had to do something very passive instead of any of that. But in that case, she would have just played it. She tried rook f7, which looks nice, but the problem is it gives white a little extra time to get this pawn rolling, which Chimmy, of course, does. She does not need to be asked twice. Check. And here, Jennifer starts giving checks. And this is, again, a really nice move. So, is black better here? I don't know. Probably, it's, black maybe is the one with the chances, but it's around equal. However, she was using the match situation. Every other game was drawn except board 1, I believe. The US was already up a game at this point. So, really, Chimmy needed to win to save the match. And in these situations, people can make all sorts of crazy decisions. Now, there are times when you really should play for your team, and that means just playing a crazy, risky move, going for some line when the team's life hangs in the balance. But the fact was that, game points, first of all, do matter. And you also have to play chess to an extent. I don't think that white can reasonably try to win this position. If she had played king d2, maybe Jennifer would have tried to play on with a move like rook e3. Probably not. And then d4, but okay, white plays rook a1. Should be able to draw this position. But definitely you're trying to draw. The problem here, and again, it's hard to criticize because when you're playing for a team, sometimes you just have to risk it and lose. And this is the kind of decision, this is the kind of mistake which I would criticize more in a regular game. But it's definitely one worth noting, which is that if you feel tons of pressure to win, for whatever reason, you outrate your opponent by 300 points, your team needs to win, you feel just, this guy's terrible, and they played horribly, they don't deserve to draw. There are definitely actually friends of mine who I think have that attitude a bit too much, where they think, my opponent doesn't deserve to draw by how they played. These are things that can lead us to make, I hate to use the word emotional decisions because I think it's overused, but it's almost what it is. And again, it can happen to anyone. This is not isolating any type of player because this is a universal type of error. But basically what it is that we're playing with, I gotta try to win, so I'm gonna play a move to try to win. The fact is that this move is not a winning attempt here. It's a losing attempt, and that's all it is. So this was a moment where I think that White had to take the draw. Now again, team situation where your team has to win, maybe the only situation you can justify it, but this wasn't even the last round. I mean, tiebreaks matter. Losing an extra game could hurt the team as well. So I think trying to draw with King D2 would have been the best option. She chose King D4, and Jennifer does not miss many chances these days. She played Knight F2. And now White can pretty much resign. If I try a move like E7, I can simply check, make sure to cover the pawn, give a check, and then snap off the rook. And that would be the end. She tried Rook F1, but now after the very nice King F6, and it could be that White just missed this, it's very possible. But whenever you walk into a space where your king could easily be mated, you need to exercise some caution. And here it's just over. Rook D3 is a mate threat. If you sack the exchange, you're not going to have any drawing chances, really. She played one more move and resigned after King takes E6. So again, you could argue, like, this game was lost. White didn't win a completely won game. But again, this kind of thing happens. And people look at engine evaluations too much. They're like, I had +9 and didn't win. I mean, that happens all the time. Sometimes it's +9, but if you don't see how to win, it's +1. You don't know. And the fact is that does happen. It does mean that you should probably work on that aspect of your game, finishing off those positions. But not winning one games happens all the time. The key is, and what separates usually the very best players from players who are not quite as good, but even the very best players make these mistakes, which is that when the game goes from completely won to maybe slightly better to maybe equal, that's when more mistakes come. You get mistake after mistake and after mistake, and it doesn't matter if you're up +13. If you make 3 mistakes in a row or 4 mistakes in a row, this is chess. There's no forgiveness here. You're probably dead. So you have to make sure you realize, first of all, realize what's happening. Realize, wait, my position's gotten worse. My position is no longer better. My position's equal. My position's worse. Realize it, and then find the best way to fight it. Whether it's, all right, I move my king back and forth, just try to keep solid. I need to get counterplay here. Whatever decisions you have to make them in accordance with your position. Trying to play King D4 here when you're only going to mate yourself is not playing for a win. It's just playing bad moves. And again, it's something that's very difficult to avoid. But at the same time, it's what really can separate you and save a lot of those half points, a lot of those full points even, if you can learn to make disciplined decisions in tough situations. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed my Olympiad double header. I might do more Olympiad games next week just because we have such a game. If you guys aren't tuning into the Olympiad, I definitely recommend it. You can check them out on Chess24. The games are on ChessBomb. I think ICC has them, so maybe chess.com too. Like tons of websites cover them. So you guys should definitely check it out. Not just obviously to see how the US teams do, but there are plenty of exciting teams to watch. And I hope you guys enjoy the future tournaments. If you like this lecture series and want to encourage me to do more, I'm definitely looking to get a slightly better camera and upgrade a few things. And you guys want to contribute, you can check out my Patreon page, which is linked below. And definitely subscribe to my channel on YouTube so you don't miss a video. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will catch you next week.